Okie dokie. Not a lot of people listening, but we're being recorded. So it's the 14th of June, 5 p.m. Eastern time, sort of, 5-ish. Welcome to Dis and Dat. And yesterday we finished up with Simon Clarke's summary of Volume 1 of Karl Marx's Capital, which, it only took a couple of days and we covered about 900 some odd pages. Which is why it's a summary. It can be very ugly when you kind of go through it page by page and word by word, because it is, as with most of Marx's work, a kind of, the pamphlets seem pretty complete, but the bigger books like Capital are collections of things that were re-edited sort of on the fly, edited later, posthumously in some instances, and then reworked relative to the languages that they were published in. So a lot of potential for being lost in translation. You'll see in a moment why that is, and why we're this year, 2 months ago, I think, and I haven't read it yet, but there is a new new version of Capital out. But it has the benefit of more scholarship applied, and some good scholarship, German specific relative to the original text, and the integration with some American authors. So it has this potential to be pretty good, but there are some gaps and things we'll probably need to discuss again. So I'm sort of trying to give you a relatively recent, that is within the last couple of years, summary. And today we're going to begin and maybe get through it's shorter than the volume 1 summary we were looking at. The number of pages is a little less, but pretty much the same tedium, and actually worse because there's a lot more arithmetic. So we're not going to do arithmetic. Marx does a lot of numerical examples, and there are ways to analyze it in a relatively reasonable way that actually can be looked at in contemporary math terms, and it's not too tedious, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to see if we can get the basic elements and then back to review, since we should be up to lecture 5 of Andy Higginbottom's treatment of volume 2. So in these gaps, because they're being done, Higginbottom's lectures we're up to lecture 5, and he only does them like once a month. So the in between, I think we can fill in with certain discussable things that we can discuss in terms of distinctions, and some broad-based issues that are still, for some people, contentious. Sometimes people will omit them in their argument in order to get something to work properly. And we could say, well, that's maybe a good thing. But then sometimes you have to sort of go back and go, well, why did they only excluded it to make it convenient rather than sort of really discuss the issue at hand. And so we don't want to get into those really down those rabbit holes, but they exist. They clearly do exist. And there's still a lot of controversy. It doesn't mean that Marxist systems don't work. It's just simply it's a matter of sort of emphasis, or as I like to think of it, as a kind of dimensional difference from a mathematical way, or as some authors will think of it, different surfaces, another way of sort of thinking about this. And a variety of authors think that way, some in very mathematical terms, others in more kind of structural terms. And so in looking at all of these different approaches to it, including Marx's original approach, then Engels' modification, and then, of course, Trotsky and Lenin and Stalin and a whole bunch of other folks, Rosa Luxemburg, etc., you need to sort of get a sense and build for yourself a kind of explainable element. Not that you're going to teach this necessarily, but you should be able to sort of explain, well, why does he use the labor theory of value in that there's labor in there somewhere. You got to sort of figure out where it comes in, where it doesn't quite work, or that you need some additional features to make it work properly. Or rethinking, for example, of what a joint product is or what cooperation is. How is it that you apply knowledge to something that to a process that where you use your hands? And it's not just reading the manual. Often that degree of mediation, particularly, let's say you're trying to teach a kid how to do something as a production line, can be, relatively problematic. So you sort of think about all these little variations. And Marx is thinking about this. I mean, he talks about the difference between horses and women and children and a bunch of other stuff that's all in the details of the reading of the text. And he does it in a, relatively interesting way. And it's just that you can kind of get lost that's why we're doing a summary. It's not, there's no test, so you don't have to remember Clarke's approach to it. But I like to think that if we kind of look at the structural outlines, because every outline has something that a kind of, as Wittgenstein would say, a family resemblance. And I think that that's kind of what we do when we use, and it is a language problem. It's clearly a language problem. When you see tankies arguing for a certain thing, you go, oh, well, that's kind of interesting, but we haven't thought about that kind of relation since Stalin. And not that Stalin was bad necessarily. See, that's where kind of, sort of the retcon of, sort of the retroactive contingency of various stories like Stalin are kind of important. Not that we want to replicate, kind of Stalinism, because frankly, I think we have enough of that with Ukraine fighting Russia. But so anyway, so we're reviewing a summary of Volume 2 of Karl Marx's Capital by Simon Clarke. There's a link there. It's a link from one site. There's a couple of different sites to do it, so it's laid out kind of wacky at times. You'll see a little brackets that refer to the pages. The whole document, that is the whole PDF, is I think 76 pages, and we sort of bludgeoned our way through the first 40 8 by 10, 8 by 11 pages. So you don't have to think about that. It's just text, right? So Volume 2 is production and circulation. You have in Volume 1, we concentrated simply on production. And in the history of Marxism, there has been, as we mentioned before, but I will mention it again, there's been a bias towards production. The production side was relatable because, it involved people. It wasn't so abstract. It was pretty concrete. You had people sweating and dying and being manipulated and exploited. And, you can see the class relations and all that sort of stuff in the production process. What Marx does in Volume 2 is begin to take the things that unify this, that is the commodity form that he sort of built up, this kind of whole thing that certain abstractions held all this business together. When barter becomes, the commodity helps you kind of move from barter to money, and then from money to capital. And these basic little leaps are kind of important because you can see them and that they're not even, and that you can see that, in fact, we still operate this kind of way in a variety of interesting ways. Sometimes a little problematic. For example, criminal finance is much more problematic, as I think you can see with Trump. But anyway, Volume 1 of Capital started with an examination of the commodity and of the process of exchange before turning to the study of production as the process of production of surplus value. That's what we looked at in Volume 1, that there's something that gets skimmed off the top. And it's not really at the top. It's actually kind of, embedded, and it comes because scale is involved. That is, it's not just the making of one widget or object. it's the making of many objects, and as you scale up, you get more things that can be easily skimmed off, and you sort of need to explain how that operates. In volume one, therefore, production and circulation. This is the second thing. Remember, production, department one, and circulation, department two. Now, remember, it's not simply departments. It's rather this large system of circulation that embodies both. And as I've explained in a prior episode, that these are kind of nested sets. These are nested sets of circulations. You have a circulation that can involve every, moment, or just simply individual moments. So there's, there are like 15 moments, let's say, and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 are kind of together at one moment, but at another moment they're not. And you can imagine all the different Venn diagrams that you would have to create. But it's kind of important because there's math involved. But it does, I think, in verbal terms and descriptive terms, you can imagine that that's kind of what happens. That is, you have a workplace that has, a small shop, but in certain parts of the United States, you have groupings of small shops that provide subcontracted objects for a bigger concern that either assembles or tests or constructs or produces some other massive kind of thing. And you see this all over capitalism. Capitalism has many of these things. It's kind of the problem in Ukraine right now, is that the Russians, have problems with their advanced technologies because they were lazy, didn't develop their own chip industry. And so they're stuck using a lot of chips that are designed, particularly specialty chips, et cetera. They're being designed and made elsewhere. And because sanctions have been put in, they're having trouble fixing things. So there are certain things that depend on, and without getting into a long lecture on this, a certain percentage of chips. And so when the Russians go running through certain places, they're like looking around, not just simply for other technology that they've sort of seized or blown up. They're looking what chips they can sort of salvage from this, because certain other things on main production lines are kind of stuck because they just don't have a certain type of customized chip. And they don't have the kind of, companies that can produce this, or they haven't, created a kind of criminal network to evade sanctions on this. So a lot of the kind of things that we talk about, well, they're delays and blah, 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 these are actually part of modern capitalism. So therefore, production and circulation, independently of one another, were looked at in volume one. Now, with circulation being treated generally in parentheses, so we're going to combine these two, and the early moment at which you talk about these things is perhaps in departments. And it's a very simplified version, as I just suggested. It's a lot more complicated than that, but we're trying to do this as Marx does in volume two by doing it relatively simply, and to express the idea that time or dimensions are more important in this. Now, let me do a digression here, and this is not in the text, and I've done lectures on this, but it's kind of hard to work through, and I mentioned it a while back, and that is the difference between constant and variable capital versus fixed and circulating capital. And it's problematic because at one level, they do share things. And if you were going to do a Venn diagram, it would be kind of a couple of spheres or something. And it shouldn't be that complicated, but it's just the way that Marx defined it. And I think it is the result with respect from the editing process. And Marx not thinking so much about, because he's front loading volume one as the kind of magnum opus, and volume two kind of, some things get a little messy because of either translation or editing, or just the fact that some things got lost. Now that's what I'm hoping that this new version is going to fix in that sense. So let's begin. this may take up our entire time today to um, explain that. And don't worry, I have a little table that you can actually look at that does this. And in fact, I got Google Gemini to do this, which I did before to do my little lecture on this problem. But it's not so much that it's confusing to me. It's just that it's fairly easy to explain. I just hope that you, dear listener and reader, can sort of work through it yourself. So we're looking at four things, and they kind of use the same stuff because that's what the book that we're talking about is capital. That there's a difference between constant and variable capital. And there's this distinction called fixed and circulating capital. And at one level, they're identical. There's not a big problem with it. But at another level, at the same time, there's something else going on. And that's the labor thing, and to get into a bigger lecture, it is whether stuff you're making has, embodies labor. And I think that's the dead end or the problematic area that some folks get into. And it, now that we have, we're doing this in English, you can see that there are some other issues that are at this level not very confusing. But once you go to something like ablation or subsumption, some wacky little terms, you go, oh, what does that mean? And so we'll try not to get there too soon. Constant capital and variable capital, C and V, and I'm going to use these expression, I don't want to get into a thing where you have subscripts and superscripts and blah, blah, blah. We're just going to do this simply, and then we'll, when we get into the direct reading, we can probably be a little more clear about this. Are different ways of looking at capital from the perspective of value creation. They come from Karl Marx's theory of value. Note that all economists generally do have theories of value of one kind or another. Marx has a kind of labor thing built into it, but it includes other stuff. It's just not, it is not reducible to labor. Although, as I said, volume one, if you're trying to sell this to a union or trade union, or a radical organization, you've got to go, well, the bad guys are copping stuff from us, and they're exploiting us, so we've got to think in those kind of terms. And so the rhetorical sort of components of it often get oversimplified or overdetermined, as we might use. So here's how they differ. Constant capital C, this refers to the value of non-labor inputs used in production. Now, these inputs do not create new value in the production process, but their existing value is transferred to the final product. You can imagine this, I hope, that, you have a machine or something or whatever, and there's certain transformation occurs, and the final product represents that kind of combination of things. So examples include buildings, machinery and equipment that is in the building, and raw materials. Now, here you don't have people. And that's the point, is that you have, materials, nature itself, logs or whatever. You have machinery and equipment to sort of shape or finish or whatever, combine things together, make it bigger, smaller, additive, subtractive, blah, 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 blah. And then you have a place to do all this crap in that, gives you shelter while you're doing your little process. So that's kind of the constant capital. Now contrast that with, and we're looking at these in pairs. So note that we have constant capital and variable capital. This is the first pair. So the second half of the pair is variable capital, V, that's in Victor. This refers to the value of labor power. And we've talked about this before from volume 1. Labor power. It's not labor itself, but value of labor power. It's already been abstracted. That is, abstracted in the sense that, Marx wanted to look at it in a more universal way, more generalizable. And so labor power is an easier way to talk about it rather than looking at, how big are your muscles? Can you do this, perform this? How many ergs is it going to take, et cetera, et cetera. So it's more about the possibility or the capability of the potentiality of labor power purchased by the capitalists. And of course, the capitalists, purchase it with wages. It's the wages paid to workers. This is the only element that creates new value during production. Now, this is much more complicated, but let's just accept, Marx's position at the front end here that, I got my stuff in my paycheck, and this is the element that, new value is being created because I, went and did my thing on the assembly line or the production line or whatever. And so wages measure that. Now let's look at the second pair. Fixed capital F and circulating capital C. Now, yes, it's the same, C as, this is a problematic, and I could get into, different ways we could talk about this, and maybe we will at some point. This is just a different pair. Let's just think about it. Fixed capital and circulating capital are different ways of looking at capital from the perspective of its durability and use in the production cycle. And this idea of cycle, a production cycle, is circulation. That is what volume 2 represents, and what ultimately is implied in volume 1 is that we're looking at a whole structure of motion of things, right? When you sort of got that sense from volume 1. And it is, how long are these things going to last? So you're obviously looking at time in a different sort of way. You're not looking at the first moment where you sort of make the damn thing and ultimately it gets to a market and somebody buys the damn thing. You're looking at a slightly larger kind of market situation. So fixed capital F, this refers to assets used in production that last for a long time. So it resembles, the machines that we're just talking about. Could even be discussing the buildings, right? And the raw materials in some way. So that there is sort of a duration element. So you're looking over this sort of accounting period and are used in multiple production cycles. Their value is gradually transferred, depreciated to the final product over their lifespan. Examples include machinery and equipment and buildings. So there's something that is shared with the constant capital of the other pair. And I have a table for this, don't get too crazy. Circulating capital C, this is different C, this refers to assets used in production that are consumed or used up in a single production cycle. Their entire value is transferred to the final product in that cycle. So it does resemble the thing that we were looking at before, but the measure of it is a singular production time period. In volume 2, Marx spends a fair amount of time and even has diagrams of trying to see, well, what gets transferred in the moment when we move from one thing to another thing. Like, to go back to the original example, we're making a damn shirt and, stuff comes in to, create a thread or fiber, and it gets combined and blah, blah, blah. And, Marx is just looking at the assembly line. He's going, the mill and the mill's relation to the production of shirts and et cetera. You can see all that sort of at work. And so certain things, are used up in a single production cycle, thread, for example, in order to sew, as opposed to thread that is woven or whatever. And Nancy will just get mad at me for this whole business. their entire value is transferred to the final product in that cycle. Examples include raw materials, wages. That is, variable capital is also considered circulating capital here. So you have the problem from just from Marx. It has to do with what he called stuff, and a lot of people like Heinrich, etc., try to figure this out, try to make it intelligible, and that's kind of what makes people confused over decades. Is that, oh well, it means this in German, and then when you say it in French, it doesn't quite make the same thing, and then when you move to English, it just makes you crazier. So that's kind of what goes on, and it's not the Dead Sea Scrolls or anything, but it does have some subtleties that one can appreciate. And it's not on the exam, but let's say we look at this table here. So we have sort of four features, and we're distinguishing, between kind of value creation in the sort of smaller scale context. And I use that, sort of contingently. We're looking in the constant capital and variable capital sense, the column 2 and column 3 here. We're looking at it from a certain kind of perspective, and it's generally smaller scale than the right hand 3 and 4 column 3 and 4, that is fixed capital and circulating capital. So you can see that they're sort of the same, and in fact they are the same in the sense that if you were applying this in an industry, you would be looking at it at the firm level. You'd be looking at it kind of for one factory, and then if you were in a particular industry, or you had a subunit, the larger unit where stuff gets put together or finished, you can see that would be the other scale elements in the last two columns here. So there's type of capital that is non-labor inputs, which are, raw materials, machinery, and buildings, and the variable capital that's applied, and this is that question of applying labor, this congealment thing, and you're creating new value. It's labor power in column column 2 or column 3, if you look at it, labor power, right? Value transfer, whether you move the existing value of things like raw materials, et cetera, that is transferred to the final product, and that you create new value under variable capital. So new value is being created. Now, this is the moment when it's created, not when it's transferred. So that will be the difference between the other pair. So some examples that are used, for example, here, raw materials, machinery, and buildings, and the variable capital, which, is mentioned in volume 1, is wages. I worked for X amount of time, and, et cetera, not to get into the deep weeds about what is relative and absolute surplus value and blah, 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 blah. But value is being created. I put my labor power in on non-labor inputs. Some value that was there before in the raw materials is now transferred to the final product. So, you could say in a luxury context, there was this, piece of gold or silver, and I was making jewelry. And so, you're creating new value from it. And it is how, in a primitive accumulation context, it's how people more in Asia, less in the United States, but it does happen. That is, there's a certain amount of value, combined in there, and you see it kind of recuperated on the one hand, and then, made more wacky on Antiques Roadshow, right? Some things don't appear to be, worth that much, and then the appraiser will go in and say, well, these are other contingencies, and the thing at auction would be blah, blah, blah. And the person freaks out or whatever. And, there's a whole side value, other thing. Some people bring their widgets in simply because, and that's not what you see on Antique Roadshow. You don't see the failures very much because people are dumb or whatever. All right. So just think again that the first pair is constant capital and variable capital. And in columns 3 and 4, fixed capital and circulating capital. That is, they have perspectives, there's a certain type of capital, there's value transfer, and there's some examples. And you can see that there's similarities. So in perspective, that is, it's a point of view, is a scalar one. That is, it's over time periods. You know, how long is this thing going to last for? Particularly if you're a klutz, you know, stuff breaks. Things like that. What is it being used for? This is that use value thing that we were thinking about again. You know, how long is this going to be? Whatever it's going to be, and as circulating capital, that component is also there as well. Now, this doesn't include, and you can see that exchange is not part of this little system here. Exchange is another thing that, you know, that's the big, you know, department but so this is still productive in the sense, or on the production side, department 1. Now, in this pairing, column 3 and 4, is long-lasting assets and short-term assets. And the difference between, you know, this is durability. The durability question is, you know, some assets, some machines, you know, will last a fair amount of time. You know, they're made out of, you know, steel, not brass, and so therefore they can do certain things that other metals would not be able to do if you built it out of that material. So, and yes, the process does have those kinds of issues. You know, you're making gears out of one material and it doesn't last quite as long, but you wanted to get it to work properly. And so in your kind of experimenting and applying the technical process, it would, you know, last a certain amount of time. And the circulating capital is the short-term assets. So the difference in the type of capital is one that is, you know, in economics, we would refer to the two columns on the left as kind of microeconomics, and on the right-hand side, macroeconomics. And that's kind of, you know, what we're talking about is the individual and the individual firm as opposed to the industry, or the scale, the larger scale of things. Now, so in the first pairing, we looked at existing value transferred to the final product. And so therefore a new value is created. The thing will do whatever it's going to do. When comparing fixed capital to circulating capital, that is, value is gradually transferred over the lifespan. So the real value of it is, you know, over the ability to keep it going or keep it alive or, you know, fix it, whatever. And as circulating capital, that is, there are transfers occurring, but it occurs not simply at the level of the production side, that is making the product, but rather it is transferred within the entire cycle. That is, the thing that you're making requires other things and doesn't really come to fruition until you sort of put it together with other stuff or whatever, or apply it certain, you know, get it out there and blow something up with it, whatever. So the examples, of course, in the first pairing of constant and variable capital is that wages, you know, are variable, and you know, raw materials, machinery, and buildings are kind of constant. Now, at a level of scale, we sort of strip away nature. It's not really so much about raw materials, although you can argue that. Machinery and buildings are fixed capital, but they're also constant capital. So you need to kind of remind yourself that it's about technology. And then the two right-hand columns, that the circulating capital is actually raw materials, which is kind of an interesting little shift. And it is actually where we get to the issues of ecology and environment. That is, as circulating capital. That is, and yes, the wrong word is to use is natural capital, but it's not really. But that's kind of the misnomer there. Raw materials become circulating capital along with wages. So wages are constant, and wages are consistent to column 2 and column 4. And raw materials moves to circulation as opposed to fixed, because it's not going to be fixed. It's just what you put into the machines, and the machines are in the buildings, and blah blah blah. This is this kind of scale or dimension of which you look at this. Now, the raw materials of circulating capitals we can see at the commodity level. For example, all commodity, or the big commodities, oil or whatever, fossil fuels, et cetera. That's why it becomes circulating as opposed to constant. And so in an oil refinery, you're doing both things. You're kind of creating circulating capital, but you're using constant capital to sort of produce it. That is, a refinery produces not simply, they do cracking, machines and stuff like that. So you're not making just one fuel like gasoline. You're making jet fuel or lubricants or whatever. So the crude oil comes in, but the output has other valorizing capabilities to it. And kind of that's what the Ukrainians are doing. They're knocking out various things that are because of specialties at various refineries that actually screws the Russians more or less. That is, when you hit a place that's doing jet fuel, you're going to create a little problem for them. But you're also creating a problem in general for the entire, oil processing industry, because, then they have to sort of work through that. Okay, I think I've used all the time I should use without getting people more confused. So I'm going to stop now, and hopefully the few people who are here will have questions so that we can use the last 9 minutes and then prepare for after hours, where we're going to have broccoli and talk about Twilight Zone. And I don't know if we're doing Prisoner tonight. I hope, it'd be nice if we did, but whatever. So your time to talk. So the key points in the absence of people yakking. Come on, roll down. There we go. Key points. There's some overlap between constant capital and fixed capital. Both include machinery and buildings. Variable capital is always considered circulating capital. Why is that? Wages are, in this assumption, there's no savings or anything else built in it. Wages are used up in one production cycle. Now, this is, it's more complicated than that, of course. But the idea is the stuff you work for kind of is about circulating, and your labor is certainly circulating in the sense that, you go from company to company offering up your labor, et cetera, et cetera. Understanding these concepts is crucial for comprehending Marx's critique of capitalism as theory of exploitation. It highlights how the value of labor creates new value, while other factors like machinery or raw material simply transfer their existing value. But you can see that it's subtle, and raw materials in one instance, at one level of production, can also be capital once the kind of transfer takes place, these transfers take place. I will look at the chat. Nobody had any questions. People got lost. Don't worry, I'm going to stop. Let me suggest that tomorrow I'm going to try and get to a quick overview of the where is it? Okay, this little section here. So it's essentially the same reading, which I'll prepare, of course. That is, in volume 2, Marx turns to the role of circulation, as we just described, in a capitalist society, and examines the relationship between capitalist production and capitalist circulation. And a lot of discussion is detailed and technical, and we will skip. But the basic argument is fundamental to Marx's account of capitalist society and both modifies and complements the analysis of Volume 1. This is like the technical appendix in certain places to Volume 1. Marx's main concern is to show in a systematic and rigorous way that circulation is subordinate to production. So it's still front-loaded. That is the idea that production is important. A lot of people take that too literally, I would assert. That capitalist social relations are rooted in production rather than in circulation, which sells, that there are people who work in offices and, people move money around and, keep the books and blah, blah, blah. All, there's circulation workers, there's circulation labor. But Marx is trying to do this simply. And of course, as I said, if you're going to sell the idea of being exploited to workers, you're going to front load it as and not care too much about bankers and clerks and secretaries and whatever. And of course, that's a problem, because in some ways you have the issue of domestic labor, which he does account for. And that's another side issue, of course. And not that it's a side issue in terms of it's trivial. It's simply, it may be misogyny and at one level, but it is about clarifying the way in which the system itself kind of operates, which is a misogynist system because of suffrage, etc. But the role of circulation is to provide a mechanism that can, through the exchange of products and the operation of markets, ensure that commodities of particular types, that is, particular use values, are produced in the quantities and the proportions required for the reproduction of this system. You sort of need enough hammers, but there's this moment at which, you don't need 5 different hammers unless you're really, a specialist. Thus, the market serves to coordinate the different branches of capitalist production. It regulates the social division of labor in a capitalist society, as in simple commodity production that we looked at in Volume 1. Now, the secondary, this is a problem for so many other people because, everyone sort of stops with Volume 1. And so the secondary literature in Volume 2 on capital, actually, it's a pretty good secondary literature, and especially on the circuits of capital that I was just talking about, is almost non-existent. Now, that's Simon Clarke's point of view, but there's enough people talking about it to make sense of it. And in fact, there's actually a pretty interesting literature on it that's not even included here. Anyway, Ben Fine, Marx's Capital, gives a brief account, circulation of capital, ideology and crisis, and the I can't remember what the C is. It's socialist economy. It's the SE in the bulletin. I can't remember. The latter article indicates the importance of the analysis for Marx's account of ideology and crisis, and does have a chapter 1, which I'll just briefly do here, so you can sort of see that it's actually important. First 3 chapters, Marx looked at the circuit of capital from 3 different points. This is totally unlike Volume 1, where you spend all this time fiddling around with the first chapter in Volume 1. We're in Volume 2, and the first chapter kind of describes the different angles and the kinds of illusions that partial views can actually create. And so the basic circuit under examination is the circuit of industrial capital. So it's all still, and this is the Soviet kind of thing, is that, industrial capital, just simply because of its dimensions and scale is really important. It, making a tractor or making some sort of industrial machine tends to be more productive relative to agriculture, et cetera. And let's not get into an argument about that. But this is important from a modern point of view, or a modernity point of view. This is composed of the purchase of labor power L and the means of production MP. We looked at that before. The act of production and sale of the commodities produced in a constantly repeated cycle. And then we'll include money and go do all the algebra. So that's kind of what that is. I don't know if anyone has any other questions. Apparently not. So let's cut the YouTube. I hope that people will understand the reason why I went deeper into this to define the difference between constant and variable capital and fixed and circulating capital, because they're sort of interesting little dichotomies that help explain the role of labor and the role of capital in this very basic thing, in the production of value, which is a much larger, made more complicated for perhaps all the wrong reasons. Go ahead and cut it, Joe.